Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha, and I like to talk about history. And I'm continuing with my discussion on, the Iranian civilizations. Today, I'm going to be discussing the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. He was Reza Shah Pahlavi. Um, who went from being a servant, literally he was a servant, to being a king. It's kind of bizarre that I've done videos and we've all talking about the ancient Persian kings from Cyrus the Great. They've always had kings. They had before Pahlavi became king. There was the Qajar dynasty, right? The last Qajar Shah um, was Ahmad Shah Qajar and of the Qajar dynasty. The Qajar dynasty started around 1789 and the last until 1925 when Ahmad Shah Qajar was deposed, overthrown by Reza Reza Shah Pahlavi. Um, but Reza Shah was not, he didn't come from an aristocratic family. He wasn't a noble. He came from a very humble background, and he was the first line that ever, in his family, whoever became a king, whoever became an aristocrat, whoever became a member of the nobility, he was actually literally a servant. He was a servant. I'm going to give his biography, but I thought since I'm mentioning the names Reza Shah and all that, the name I'm going to do a little discussion explanation regarding names. So um, Iranians didn't have last names, right? Like we do typically have last names in due to Anglo-Saxon influence, right? Today, if somebody has a first name and they have a last name, right? The last name is typically the parent's name, the family name, or the father's name, right? My first name is Olurotimi Osha. That's my given name. And my last name is Osha. That's my father's last name. My father's last name is also Osha. And my siblings have that last name as well. So this is the naming convention which we adopted due to Anglo-Saxon influence, right? The reason why I'm doing this is, you see, as I'm calling the name of Reza Shah, who was the first um, Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. Shah means king in Persian, right? It means king. So he was the first Shah of the Persian dynasty in 1925, and he founded the Pahlavi dynasty. Significantly, he adopted the last name Pahlavi, right? He adopted the last name Pahlavi in 1919, actually. So in 1919, the Shah then they created a convention, a regulation that Iranians should adopt a hereditary surname. That was in 1919. Iranians didn't have a surname. It wasn't common for Iranians to have a surname. They just had a given name, and then they could identify also with the name of the locality or province or village they come from, right? So they didn't have a surname, and this wasn't hereditary, right? It wasn't a hereditary family name like we have today. We have the first name, which is a given name, the last name, which is a family name that one inherits from their father, or typically, it's patriarchal. Some places may have it matriarchal, but the Anglo-Saxon convention for us is to have the patriarchal, hereditary last name. Um, this became law in 1919 when Reza Shah Pahlavi, when he became the Shah of Iran in 1925, he would enforce the regulation. It wasn't enforced then, but he would enforce it nationally. So this is very significant about Reza Shah because he did a great job in centralizing and nationalizing um, um, creating that national cohesion in Iran. So, by the way, he's the one who changed the name of Persia to Iran, right? So formally, he did this in 1935. So, but he was big on enforcing national conventions, regulating things nationally, centralizing power. So he took the last name of Pahlavi, right? And Pahlavi, that was sort of it was a nod, a reference to the Sasanian Empire's language, the ancient language of the Sasanian Empire. Pahlavi. I've talked about the Sasanian Empire. That was it was a Persian empire. Uh, they where they overthrew the Parthians, right? They overthrew the Parthians. The Parthians overthrew the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, who had ruled Iran um, from around 330 BC until 245, 247, until they were finally defeated in around 129 BC by the Parthians, the Parthian kingdom. And the Sasanian defeated the Parthian kingdom in the Sasanians were Persians. They defeated the Parthian kingdom in 224 AD. They were eventually conquered by the Arabians, by the Arabian Islamic Empire, right? Starting with a conquest by Caliph Abu Bakr in 1633, and ultimately in 1654 they fell in the Rashidun conquest, right? And then there was the rule of the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids, right? So um, you can see the early signs of Reza Shah's um, Persian nationalism, because this is very significant. His Persian nationalism, because he would institute the Persianization of Iran as Shah of Iran. So you can see the early signs of his Persianization when he took as his last name Pahlavi, right? Pahlavi, he took as his last name Pahlavi, which was a reference to the ancient language of the Sasanian Empire, which was the last Persian empire before the Islamic conquest of 1651, the Islamic rule of 1651. So you can see those elements of Persian nationalism in Reza Shah, which is interesting. It's rather interesting because Reza Shah was not Persian, right? He was not a Persian by ethnicity. I've done videos explaining the various ethnic groups in Iran. Persians are the majority by over 61%, but there are other ethnic groups as well in Iran. There are the Kurds. Kurds about 10%. There are many different ethnic groups apart from the Persians. There are Azerbaijani. There are um, uh, the Armenians. Even Arabians. Arabians are just about constitute just about 2%. So there are many different ethnic groups in Iran now, but Persians are the majority, over 61%, and those early great civilizations were Persian kingdoms, right? Cyrus the Great, from 550 BC, was Persian. The Sasanian Empire was Persian, right? So, but there's so many different ethnic nationalities in Iran, and Persian is the official language of all Iranians. However, the Shah, right, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah, was not a Persian. He was actually a Mazani, right? His father was Mazani. Um, his father was Mazani, and his mother, neither, nor was his mother even Persian as well. His mother was an immigrant from either Georgia. It's unclear that she was either from Georgia or she was Yerevan. That's Armenian, right? Either Armenian. She was an immigrant from either Georgia or Armenia. Remember, in the 19th century, I talked about the Russo-Persian Wars that occurred between 1804 and 1813, and also between 1826 and 1828, when Iran had to concede some of all its territories in the Caucasian territories, right, in the Caucasus area, right. I discussed what that is, the Caucasus region. Um, so I discussed that region already, and so they conceded all those territories. And that included Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, right, to Russia. So his mother was an immigrant from either Georgia or Yerevan, or that's Armenia, and his father was Mazani, right? His father was not a Persian, so he didn't have any Persian ethnicity. He wasn't an aristocrat. He didn't have any nobility in his blood, even though Iranians, their rulers had these long dynasties. There were aristocrats in Persia, in Iran, right? There were those who were of aristocratic lineage. People like to talk about the prime minister that was deposed, right? That was deposed to consolidate the power of Reza Shah's son. Reza Shah's son, of course, was the deposed Shah, who was deposed in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution. Uh, the Islamic Revolution, right, which brought in the Ayatollahs in 1979. Um, Mossadegh was prime minister, who was forced out in a coup orchestrated by the CIA and the Brits, right, to consolidate the power of the son of Reza Shah, right. And Mossadegh came from an aristocratic background. He was an aristocrat. Mossadegh, I'll do a video discussing Mossadegh later on, but just briefly, Mossadegh, he was roughly the age of um, Reza Shah. Mossadegh was born in 1882. Reza Shah was born in 1878. So Reza Shah was just about 4 years older than, um, um, sorry, Reza Shah was 4 years older than Mossadegh, right? Mohammed Mossadegh, who became prime minister in around 1950, 1951. He was prime minister. He was the one who nationalized um, the oil companies, right? The companies and resources, the oil reserves, and the um, the oil sites, oil facilities. He nationalized it in 1951, and of course, was it 1951 or 1953? In the 1950s, anyway, and subsequently there was the CIA, British MI6 plot, coup that led to his coup and his arrest. Uh, so they had that's Reza Shah and Mossadegh. They had two different backgrounds. Mossadegh was an aristocrat, right? His great grandfather was had been a Shah, right? Had been a Shah. So he was a descendant of a Shah of Iran. That's a king. So he was a solid member of the aristocratic class. In fact, Mossadegh was the first person in Iran who got a PhD from a Western university, a European university. So Mossadegh went to school in Sciences Po. Everybody knows Sciences Po. I don't know if that people call it Sciences Po, Sciences Po. It's the most prestigious university in France. So he went to study law in Sciences Po in France, and then he went on to Switzerland to study law. He received his PhD in law from an elite university in Switzerland. So you can see they had very different backgrounds. On the other hand, Reza Shah was actually never had any formal education. And so now I'm going to get back and discuss his background. He came from a poor background, no formal education. But before I get into that, I wanted to clarify the issue of last names. So Iranians didn't have last names. And I wanted to do this because I discussed the Roman Empire a lot as well. And I did something talking about the Roman Empire just to show that, well, it's the last name, first name, last name convention we use today, which is standardized. It's an Anglo-Saxon thing, and different regions, different peoples have their own naming conventions. My family as well, in my tribe in Nigeria, at least my tribe, Yorubas, we didn't use last names as well. So it was something that came in with the British. I think my father's generation is actually the first to use that last name, that name, the British naming convention, right? So it's very common in many different parts of the world. So with the Romans, for instance, I'm saying this because we all know Julius Caesar, and I wanted to clarify. Somebody was saying Julius Caesar's. I heard somebody mentioning that Julius Caesar, his first name was Julius. That's not the case. So the Romans had, typically their naming convention was three names, right? So they had what was called the praenomen, right? Praenomen, the nomen, and the cognomen, right? Caesar was his cognomen, right? So his name was Gaius Julius Caesar. That's how he was identified. So Gaius was the nomen. Well, sorry, Gaius was a prenomen. You can consider the prenomen like a first name, Gaius, the given name. So Gaius. So that's how he would have been known during his time, Gaius. Um, Important then nomen, right? So Julius was his nomen, right? Nomen is not exactly a last name as we know it today. It could be a clan name. It's sort of a family name, right? That maybe the family, the branch of the family sort of can be known by. It's a larger branch of the family. So he came from the Julii family, the Julii family. Now there's a bit. It's tricky because there's a masculine form of that family name, and then there's a feminine form, right? So for instance, his sister was known as Julia, right? So the females, it's Julia, so it's Juli, and with an A, Julia. So, but he came from the Julii family. It's spelled Julii. Now, Julius, I get that's a masculine form. So Julius, so that's like the family name. It's like a clan name, right? A clan name, a family name, right? And then cognomen, right? Caesar, that was his cognomen. So cognomen is sort of an identifier, right? And it's hereditary. So, but it's like a nickname. It's like a nickname, something that distinguishes the family, right? So maybe it's something. Sometimes family they would use a cognomen that makes the family important, right? Something that the family is known for, right? So that was the cognomen Caesar. They say the Caesars. So he inherited it, right? He inherited it. Um, but it is said that Caesar was from an ancestor, right? An ancestor who had fought in the one of the Punic Wars, uh, one of the Punic Wars in which elephants were used. So they said, see, Julius Caesar had an ancestor who killed an elephant, right? So I think um, I think Caesar or something refers to elephant in Latin. So that's one of the narratives, that's one of the myths or narratives that's been spawned that Caesar himself popularized as Julius Caesar. So that was sort of a, that was sort of a family identifier, distinguishing nickname, right? But it becomes hereditary. So that's Caesar. The alternative story that was spun was that um, he had an ancestor who was born through Caesarean section, right? Because Caesar also means to cut, right? In Latin, to cut out, and we know Caesarean section today. So it's unclear. But again, the naming convention, it's not anglicized as we know it, right? In the Roman during the Roman era, right? Amongst the Latins, so you could see they had the praenomen Gaius, nomen Julius, cognomen Caesar, right? Gaius Julius Caesar, right? So Caesar wasn't his last name, it wasn't his father's name or anything like that. And so you see that in Iran as well, in Persia was common. They didn't have last names until 1919. It passed a law. It wasn't enforced. But when um, Reza Shah, who chose the last name of Pahlavi, right, as a nod to the ancient Sasanian Persia, the last Persian empire before the Islamic conquest, the Sasanian Empire. Um, he chose Pahlavi in 1919. In 1925, when he became a Shah, he passed regulations and enforced those laws, right? Especially for to create a national civil registry. He forced those laws. Um, Reza Shah was a very complex, very significant ruler of Iran because despite being illiterate, but despite having an illiterate background, it's acknowledged he was highly intelligent and he tried to force westernization and modernization on Iranians, and we will see this as I discuss further. So, and you can see how he forced, Iranians to take a hereditary last name so that he could create a national civil registry. At the same time, he made all Iranians have a national identity card. So he tried to modernize Iran, and he tried to create that national cohesion, right? National cohesion, Persian identity amongst Iranians, even though he himself wasn't Persian, right? He wasn't Persian. He was Mazani. His father was Mazani. His mother was was an immigrant, either from Georgia or Armenia. It was unclear. So it's interesting. He was born in 1878. His father was a major. He was born to a major um, in the Persian Cossack Brigade. Right, they were trained by like a military unit that were trained by the Russians. So um, uh, Iran, Persia was a shadow of its ancient self. It was a shadow of itself, and it was a basically a vassal of the Russian Empire this time. One part was another part was the southern part was sort of it was a colony in all but name, right? In name, all but name only to the British Empire, which had its jewel, the British Raj, the British Empire, British India, right? It was in order to protect British India um, from the Russian Empire. So they sort of left uh, the kings of Iran, the Shahs, were left alone and enjoyed some relative autonomy because Iran provided a buffer between these two giant empires. So they were sort of a buffer. That was basically what they were. But it meant they lost their independence to both Russia and Britain, Great Britain, right? They lost, so they were sort of subservient to these two great powers. So Reza Shah's father was a major, humble origin, so major, so not a high person, like low level officer um, in the Persian Cossack brigade, and no aristocratic background whatsoever. His wife, the mother, that's Reza Shah's mother, was an immigrant, right, from again either Georgia or Armenia. Interestingly, um, when Reza Shah was just 8 months old, before he turned a year, his father died. Right, his father died. When his father died, his mother would marry 1 year after. Right, would remarry, and when she remarried, she left him with. She would take him, leave him with her brother. So she had a brother. So her brother too, would have been an immigrant. So no roots, no strong roots in Iran. She would leave him with the brother, and the brother in turn would take him uh, take him to a family friend and leave him with the family friend. So there, he basically worked like a help, right? Like a help growing up. So he didn't have a privileged background. He was orphaned early. We don't know anything about his mother. Once she married, we don't know anything about her. But so he had a very difficult uh, childhood, no formal education whatsoever. But he was a hard, he did service jobs, he was hardworking. Interestingly, so he joined he started off being a help, just serving the Persian Cossack brigade, running errands for them. And when he was 16, he joined the Persian Cossack brigade. He joined, that's the military. And he would, he was running errands. And at some point when he turned 25, he became a servant to a guard and servant to to a Dutch consular general, right? So a Dutch consular general who was a diplomat, became a servant to a Dutch diplomat there in Iran. And so, of course, there was a World War, and he distinguished himself by being very proficient in the use of uh, artillery and the machine gun. So it earned him a nickname. It was called Reza Maxim. Reza Maxim. He was very proficient, and so um, when he was around 34, he was promoted to the equivalent of captain, right? And since from there he started to have these rapid promotions. In 1915, he was made a colonel, right? He was made a colonel, and so he'd come to the attention of some British, officers, and was particularly lucky. He caught the attention of a very important British general, right, called Ironside. Ironside would go on to become a field marshal. He was one of the most distinguished officers of the British military. He would go on to become a field marshal. He was a baron, right, Baron Ironside. So you know, Russia's there was that Russian influence um, over over Iran. But once there was the Bolshevik Revolution, which broke out during the First World War, the Brits were now very concerned, right? And they started to use Iran, right? Persia, Iran. They started to use it sort of as a staging ground to fight, uh, to launch attacks, or at least stave off and launch attacks against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, right? Because they had the Bolshevik Revolution and they had the Civil War, which was a civil war, which was they had the White Army versus the Red Army. That's what they were called in their fight in the USSR, right? So it became a Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and so the uh, the Russians or the USSR were trying to make incursions um, into into Iran, into Persia. They were successful in carving out a northern part, further northern part of Iran, and they call that place the Persian Soviet Socialist Republic. They carved out the northern part, and so the British were very concerned, right? Of course, a lot of countries in Europe started to fight the Bolsheviks, the who had taken over the country, and there was a civil war in Russia, in the USSR. That's between the Whites and the Red Army, the White Army versus the Red Army, and they kept on trying to get into Iran. The British used Iran at this time, Persia. They used it as a base to fight Russia. And so there was that concern that the Russian forces, the USS forces from the USSR, were going to try and control, you know, take over, create a communist government in Persia as well. So this was what the situation, what was going on. In fact, there were 15 1,500 guerrilla forces, right? Guerrilla forces who um, uh, included Kurds, Azerbaijanis, right? And they were coming into making incursions into Persia at that time. So, however, the Shah of Iran, Ahmad Shah Qajar, right, he was very weak. He showed no interest in ruling. His father had been deposed when he was very young, when he was just about 11 years old, because he was very young. He was underage at the time. His father was deposed because there was a constitutional crisis, right? They wanted to make around, I think, a constitutional monarchy or something. They wanted to something about the constitution, and so there was his father was deposed for him, and so when he came of age, he'd been ruling Iran, but he was very weak. He was very, very weak. He was incompetent. He showed a reluctance to rule. So now the communist forces were now making inroads and inciting uh, minorities again, the Kurds, the Azerbaijanis, Armenians, they were coming and they were fighting, trying to take over, uh, trying to take over Persia, right, to turn it communist. So he had the forces. The forces were reluctant. They couldn't do anything. There was all sorts of uprisings going on in Persia, all sorts of communists. And so the Shah couldn't show any resolve to use the military effectively. He couldn't show the will to rule. So the British favored um, Reza Shah at that time because he seemed resolute. He was determined. He was tough. So he was promoted to brigadier general at this time in 1921. And at this time, the British, they'd been monitoring him, writing about him. They wrote very good reviews about him. He had a good military record, and they thought he was the ideal person who could lead a force and create order in Iran. Why was it important to create order in Iran? Remember, I'd done a video and I'll discuss some more. Iran had discovered oil in 1908. So a British man, a British millionaire named William Knox Darcy had been given exclusive rights to prospect for oil in 1901 by the Shah of Iran. He found oil in 1908. The British then got interested. The British government got interested when they found oil. And so he had initially, in his initial concession agreement initial contract with the Shah of Iran, before he found oil, he'd given them about £20,000, right? And then he offered them equal amount of shares, and he promised 16% of the net profits, right? 16% of the net profits from uh, the oil revenues, right, that were generated, 16% of the net profit. Net profit means after you've removed expenses, right, all the expenses, and that's your net profits. So this is important because it will cause uh, a conflict later on. So they offered him that. When oil was discovered, the British government got interested. So they organized a group of investors, and they created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, right? And they reorganized things. And then the British bought 51% of the company, right, of all the rights of the concession agreement of William Knox Darcy. They paid £2 million for it, £2 million. So basically, the British government now owned half of this company that owned the oil rights, that was understood to own the oil rights in Iran. So that's how. So Britain was very interested in protecting their interests there as well, right? So they now had oil. Basically, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was allowed to run like a state within a state. So it was acting like a government. And this was one of the methods that the European companies, this was used to colonize nations, right? So the British never formally colonized Iran, but by the fact that they bought this company, they bought the majority, they bought 51% of the shares. So they owned the majority of this company that owned all the oil on paper by this concession agreement, this contract. They owned all the oil in Iran, right? They gave this company, they empowered this company to act like a state, right? Itself, they had the state power within a state. So it was like a neo state, right? A de facto state within the state of Iran. So it was, uh, exercising this, right? This state powers, literally, even though it was supposed to be a company. Um, so at this time, General Ironside, they got um, the British, the Russians no longer controlled the Cossack, the Persian Cossack Brigade from 1920 because they had now turned the Tsarist empire had been overthrown by the Bolsheviks, right? So it was now a communist state, and the British were now barring contact, the relations between Russia, the USSR, and Persia because they had their interests, protecting their interests in the oil. So Reza Shah was promoted to brigadier general. He took about 4,000 troops and went and put down the attempt. Right, he put down the attempt by he stopped, he blocked the incursion by the 1500, supported by communists and the Red Army. The Red Army was supporting as well to try and uh, effect a guerrilla war to take over the Persian government. So he was successful in repelling them. And further on, he now did executed a coup d'etat, literally a coup d'etat. And when he stopped this, a variety of things happened. The Shah himself, Ahmad Shah Raja, he initially took a trip overseas. He thought, well, that Reza Shah was just going to um, restore order and still acknowledge him. But once he went overseas, uh, Reza Shah convinced the parliament. They call it Majlis, right? The Iranian parliament, Persian parliament. They call it Majlis. He persuaded them to depose him, right, to oust him as Shah. So they agreed this would happen later on. They stopped him. He couldn't come back. There was a prime minister named Zia Tabataba. Had a, you know, Zia Tabataba. So he was prime minister at that time, and eventually Reza Shah sort of took over because Reza Shah was one who controlled the military. He was always wearing his military uniform. Reza Shah was made Minister of War when he had successfully put down the insurrection, but he would literally oust the Prime Minister Tabataba Ziad. Uh, he ousted him, and then Reza Shah became prime minister, and then in time he convinced Parliament. Parliament then, after they deposed the exiled king, that's Ahmad Shah Qajar, and decided to install Reza Shah as the new king of Iran. So in 1925, so you can see the serendipitous meteoric rise from being a servant, an orphan, a servant with no aristocratic, no noble background, to depose uh, a king, right, that had a long lineage. And so that's how Reza Shah came to be the Shah of Iran, king of Iran, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, right? In 1925, he was coronated in 1926. His son was born in 1919. That's Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, right, who became the second uh, uh, Pahlavi Shah. He was born in 1919, and when he was 6 years old, he was installed as the crown prince of Persia, right? So that's how he went. That's how Reza Shah went from being an orphan without any aristocratic connection or background, uh, without any education, but he distinguished himself in the military in the Persian Cossack Brigade. The British sponsored his coup, by the way. They provided him the munitions and they sponsored his coup. So the British were the ones who uh, engineered and sponsored the coup in which he deposed the Shah of Iran. That's Ahmad Shah Qajar. Um, and the British sort of had this pattern of doing things. If people watch the movie or read the biography of Idi Amin, they did the same thing in Uganda, right? So they had this pattern of using an illiterate. Idi Amin was an illiterate, like some kind of buffoon, right? When there were many, Milton Obote was educated, there are many educated people there, but those educated people tended to be very nationalist, and then they're trying to circumvent or check the interests of the British. And the British feel, well, if they use someone without, someone they think is a buffoon that they can manipulate and control easily because he doesn't have any real aristocratic background, he doesn't have a base to support him, he doesn't have the education to think, to be visionary. That's, I guess, maybe that's the assumption. They think they can use him. So there's that pattern of doing things, right? During the British colonialism or European colonialism, it was very common. So they would, and these things would end up causing conflicts, over time in various places where they left their footprint, right? So they would take somebody like a parvenu, that's an upstart, somebody without any that appears to them to be a buffoon that they can manipulate, and they would use him to depose someone with more credentials or more credibility or more upper class background or whatever, right? Who has a base. Because that other person would be easier to manipulate, and so this was the case of Reza Shah. Reza Shah had no base, right? He'd been in the military for a long time, but he would end up, shocking them. He turns out he was a highly intelligent man, and so was his son. He did many things that were autocratic, but he was very nationalistic, and he was looking out for the rise of Iran. Now he was brutal. He did some terrible things, but we would. I'm going to continue and we'll look at the background of Reza Shah. So this was somebody who was completely illiterate, right? He was illiterate, um, no formal education whatsoever. He was highly intelligent. It turns out, there are some people who are like that. He was highly intelligent, um, and but he was also brutal. He was an autocrat, but he was a nationalist. Um, he was very interested in the modernization of Iran, which was rather, um, some kind of paradox considering that he had no formal education himself, but he would set the foundation for the modernization of Iran. He would create the first university in Iran, which is, that sounds like, that's a paradox again, since I'd done videos and I'd said the first university that was created in the world was in Persia, right, in 271 AD during the Sasanian Empire. Well, Iran fell a lot since the time of after the Islamic conquest, right? Under Arabian rule. So a lot of things just went, it became Iran, the Persians became a shadow of their high learning, high education. And by the time Reza Shah came into power, there were no there was no secular education. All the education there, all the schools were actually Muslim. They were Islamic. They were masradas. They were these were Islamic schools, right? That was all they had in Persia and Iran then. They didn't have any form of secular education. But he would change this. Now I'm going to continue and talk about his reign, and his accomplishments. I'm going to stop here. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.